It was just an ordinary day for the elderly man. At 81 years old, life had become slower for him, but he had learned to accept the changes that had come after his stroke. His left side was weaker, and his vision wasn't what it used to be, but he still cherished his independence. He had grown used to moving at his own pace, taking one day at a time, even though his family and friends often reminded him to be careful. But he hated relying on others, so he made sure to go about his days as normally as possible. On this particular morning, he had decided to visit the local grocery store. His list was simple, just a few essentials he liked to keep in stock. It wasn't far from his home, and he knew the route well. He enjoyed the drive, even though it sometimes made him feel uneasy. The cars, the noise, and the speed, everything was different now, and though he had learned to adjust, it was never the same. As he drove through the familiar streets, he couldn't help but notice the trees lining the sidewalks, their leaves changing colors as autumn settled in. The bright oranges and yellows reminded him of his younger days when he would take long walks in the park with his wife. She had passed away a few years ago, and those walks had been something they always enjoyed together. He missed her. But today he was focused on his mission, getting to the store and back without much trouble. Arriving at the parking lot, he found a space near the entrance, just like he liked. Parking wasn't as easy as it used to be, but he had his routine. He carefully turned the wheel, trying to line the car up between the white lines. But his vision wasn't what it once was. The stroke had left his left eye with limited sight, and he couldn't judge the space as well as he used to. He wasn't worried, though. He'd parked here dozens of times before. Still, he felt a small knot in his stomach as he adjusted the wheel one more time, trying to get the car into the space. He didn't want to be a bother to anyone else, even though the lot wasn't very crowded at the moment. It was a simple mistake. The left side of his car was a little too close to the line. But to him, it seemed like no big deal. He couldn't have known that in just a few minutes this small error would lead to a much bigger problem. He shifted the car into park and turned off the engine. There were a few cars nearby, but none too close. He took a deep breath, adjusting his glasses, and grabbed his shopping bag from the passenger seat before getting out of the car. The man was slow to move, his joints aching a bit as he walked to the store entrance. The air was cool and he tugged his jacket tighter around his shoulders. As he stepped inside the store, he felt a sense of relief. The bustling sounds of the store, the clatter of carts and the murmur of shoppers were comforting. He had done this many times over the years, and it brought him a sense of normalcy. He quickly got what he needed, grabbing items from the shelves with a practiced hand. He didn't linger. The sooner he finished, the sooner he could return home and enjoy the comfort of his own space. After about 30 minutes, he was ready to head back to his car. He made his way to the checkout counter, carefully placing each item on the belt. The cashier smiled and greeted him, and he nodded back, trying to engage in some small talk, but it was hard for him to focus. His mind was tired, and he longed for the peace of his house. After paying for his groceries, he made his way out of the store and back to his car. But as he approached, he noticed something strange. A police car was parked beside his vehicle. He hadn't noticed the officer at first, but now, standing at the rear of his car, he saw the officer, arms crossed, watching him. He wasn't sure what to think. Was he being targeted for the way he had parked? He looked down at his car and saw that it was still partially across the line. He had missed it when he parked, but to him it wasn't much of an issue. It wasn't as if he was blocking anyone else after all. He had seen much worse in parking lots before. The officer approached him, walking with purpose. The man tried to steady himself, taking a deep breath. He had learned a long time ago not to get too flustered, but something about the officer's presence made him uneasy. Maybe it was the uniform. Maybe it was the way the officer looked at him like he was in trouble. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice firm. "Do you realize you've parked your car in a restricted zone?" The man blinked, his heart rate quickening slightly. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to," he said, trying to explain in his slow, measured voice. "I've had a stroke and my vision is a bit not what it used to be." I didn't see the line clearly. The officer didn't seem to take much interest in his explanation. Instead, he just nodded, as though hearing the words but not truly understanding them. "I'll need to give you a ticket for this. It's illegal to park here." The man was taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped that maybe the officer would understand his situation, maybe even show a little kindness. After all, he wasn't causing any harm. He had just made a simple mistake. But the officer didn't seem to care. Instead, he reached for his ticket book and began scribbling down the details. "I'm sorry, officer. It's just that I didn't see the line properly," the elderly man repeated, his voice a bit shaky now. "Please, I'm just trying to get home." The officer paused for a moment, eyeing the man before continuing to write. "You shouldn't be driving if you can't see properly," the officer said, his words cutting through the air. "It's dangerous." The man's face fell. He had heard this before from family members, from friends. Everyone had been telling him that maybe it was time to stop driving. But he didn't want to. He didn't want to feel like he was losing his last bit of independence. He had worked hard his whole life, and giving up something like driving felt like admitting that he was too old, too weak, too useless. He opened his mouth to say something, to explain himself further, but the words caught in his throat. The officer didn't seem to care about his reasons, about his struggles. He was just doing his job. As the officer continued to write the ticket, the elderly man felt a growing sense of helplessness. The anxiety that had been building inside him since the officer first arrived was now overwhelming. His hands trembled slightly as he stood there, feeling small and invisible. The officer handed him the ticket, not saying another word. Without waiting for a response, the officer turned and walked back to his car, leaving the elderly man standing in the parking lot, feeling like he had just been dismissed. As the man climbed into his car, he sat there for a moment, staring at the ticket in his hands. He had always tried to do the right thing, to live his life with integrity and kindness. But today it seemed like his simple mistake had cost him more than just a fine. It had shaken his sense of self, making him feel as though he wasn't even seen as a human being anymore. He started the engine and drove slowly out of the parking lot, his heart heavy and his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. As the elderly man drove slowly from the parking lot, his hands gripped the steering wheel with a sense of nervous tension. The streets outside the grocery store were quieter than usual, and he found himself lost in thought, the ticket resting on the passenger seat beside him. He couldn't stop thinking about the officer and the way he had treated him. The harshness in the officer's tone, the way he had been dismissed so quickly, it stung. He had only made a small mistake, a mistake that anyone could have made, yet it felt like he had been judged as something less than human. He glanced at the ticket again, seeing the fine he was being charged. It wasn't a large amount, but that didn't matter. The real cost wasn't the money. It was the feeling of being belittled. It was the sting of being treated like an inconvenience when all he had wanted was to go about his day. The man tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept wandering. His left eye, the one still affected by the stroke, didn't help him navigate the streets as easily as he would have liked. He had to squint harder than usual to make out the road signs and the cars around him. He had never been a fast driver, but today it felt like everything was happening too quickly. He turned into his neighborhood, hoping the familiar streets would offer him some comfort. It was a quiet area, with neatly manicured lawns and rows of houses that all looked the same, yet different in their own way. As he made his way down the street, he spotted his own home at the end of the block, a small one-story house with a garden that he had lovingly tended over the years. It was a place he had raised a family, a place filled with memories of better days. His wife had always been the one to plant the flowers and vegetables in the garden, but after her passing, he had taken over the task. He wasn't as good at it as she had been, but he tried his best. The garden still had a few flowers blooming, despite the cooler weather. The sight of them brought a small smile to his face. But as he pulled into his driveway, the weight of the ticket in his hand pulled him back into reality. He didn't want to be stuck in his thoughts, didn't want to dwell on the interaction with the officer. He parked his car and sat there for a moment, staring out at the empty yard. The silence of the moment felt louder than it should have. He knew that his family would be disappointed when they found out about the ticket. They had warned him so many times about driving, about how it wasn't safe for him anymore. They didn't understand, though. They didn't understand how important it was for him to feel like he still had control over his life, over his independence. To them, he was just an old man who needed to slow down, to rely on others. But to him, that would be the beginning of the end. With a deep sigh, he got out of the car and made his way inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. He had become accustomed to the silence since his wife had passed, but today it felt different. Today it felt oppressive. He kicked off his shoes and shuffled into the living room, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort. He sat down in his favorite chair, the one by the window, and stared out at the street. His mind continued to replay the scene with the officer, each word and gesture looping in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling of being small, of being dismissed. It wasn't the first time in recent years that he had felt that way. Since his stroke, there had been more and more moments where he felt invisible, like people were no longer seeing him for who he was, but rather for the frailty his age had brought. He had always been independent, a man who had worked hard his whole life, raised a family, and built a life for himself. Now it seemed like all anyone saw was his age and his limitations. As he sat there lost in thought, the phone rang. He didn't have to look at the caller ID to know who it was. It was his daughter. She called every few days to check on him, to make sure he was okay. He had always been grateful for her calls, but today he didn't feel like talking. He let the phone ring until it went to voicemail, then picked it up and listened to her message. "Hi, Dad, just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. I was thinking about you today, and I wanted to remind you that you don't have to do everything on your own. You can always call me if you need help. I love you." His heart sank as he listened to her words. He knew she meant well, but hearing them made him feel like he was a burden, like he was incapable of doing things for himself. He didn't want to need help. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't do everything he once could. The stroke had already taken so much from him, and he wasn't ready to give up any more of his independence. He set the phone down and stared out the window again, the weight of the world pressing down on him. It was only a parking ticket, but it felt like much more. It was a reminder of everything he was losing: his independence, his ability to drive, his sense of self-worth. It was a small thing, but it had triggered something much deeper inside him. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts that were swirling around in his mind. He had always been a proud man, proud of the life he had built and the way he had lived it. Now it seemed like the world was slowly taking everything away from him: his health, his independence, his dignity. After a few moments, he stood up and walked to the kitchen, trying to distract himself. He opened the fridge and took out a carton of milk, pouring himself a glass. He sat down at the kitchen table, the cold glass in his hands offering a small sense of comfort. But even as he sipped the milk, his thoughts kept drifting back to the officer, to the way he had treated him. The man wasn't angry, not exactly. He was just frustrated with the way things had turned out. He knew that the officer had been just doing his job, but it felt like the officer had missed something. The fact that the man wasn't just an old person making a simple mistake. He was a person with a history, with a life full of experiences, a man who had worked, loved, and struggled in ways the officer could never understand. He set the glass down, letting out a sigh. The frustration was still there, but now it was mixed with a sense of sadness. He missed the days when he felt strong, when he felt like he could take on the world. Now he felt like he was just drifting, slowly losing everything he had worked so hard for. He knew his family would be disappointed when they found out about the ticket. They would probably tell him it was time to stop driving, to let someone else take the wheel. But that was the last thing he wanted. He didn't want to give up his independence, not yet. He wasn't ready for that. The day wore on, but the weight of the morning's events didn't lift. As evening approached, he went to bed early, hoping that sleep would bring him some peace. But even as he closed his eyes, the image of the officer's stern face, the harsh words, and the ticket in his hand stayed with him. It was just a small mistake, yet it felt like so much more. The next few days passed in a blur. The elderly man did his best to ignore the frustration that had taken root inside him, but it wasn't easy. Every time he thought about the ticket, about the officer's cold dismissal of his situation, the feeling of anger and sadness welled up again. He couldn't help but replay the interaction in his mind, each moment more painful than the last. But what hurt the most was the growing realization that he might not be able to ignore the truth much longer. His age was catching up with him, and things were changing in ways he wasn't ready for. On Monday morning, he decided to drive to the local pharmacy to pick up a prescription. He had no intention of staying out long, just a quick errand, he told himself. But as he started the car and pulled out of his driveway, a familiar sense of unease crept over him. His vision was still blurry in certain areas, and his hands shook slightly when he gripped the wheel. It was getting harder and harder to ignore the signs. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew his ability to drive was slipping away. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside as he drove down the street. He told himself that he was fine, that he could handle it. He'd been driving for so many years, surely a small mistake here and there wouldn't make a big difference, right? As he approached the intersection near the pharmacy, he saw a police car waiting at the red light. The officer behind the wheel glanced over at him, and the elderly man's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but something about the officer's gaze made him feel self-conscious. His hands tightened around the wheel and he focused hard on the traffic signal. The light turned green and the man continued on his way. The officer's car followed behind for a while, but the elderly man didn't think much of it. He was more focused on the task at hand, trying to keep his attention on the road. But as he turned into the parking lot of the pharmacy, his heart sank when he saw the police car pull in right behind him. He parked his car and was about to get out when the officer's car stopped behind him. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, walking with purpose toward the elderly man's car. His face was serious, and the man couldn't help but feel a sense of dread rising within him. The officer knocked on his window, and the elderly man rolled it down, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. "Sir, I need to speak with you for a moment," the officer said, his voice firm. "Can you step out of the car, please?" The elderly man's mind raced. He had done nothing wrong, at least nothing he knew of. His stomach twisted as he hesitated for a moment before opening the door and stepping out, his legs feeling a bit unsteady. "Is everything okay, officer?" the man asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, sizing him up, his eyes scanning the elderly man's face as if looking for something. The man felt a growing unease, like he was being judged, though he didn't know why. "Do you know why I'm stopping you?" the officer finally asked. The elderly man shook his head. "No, officer, I don't. Is there a problem with my parking?" The officer didn't immediately respond. He walked around to the back of the car, inspecting it carefully. The elderly man stood there, frozen, wondering what was happening. He had parked his car properly, hadn't he? He had made sure not to block anyone or park in a restricted area. So why was the officer bothering him? "Did you know your brake lights aren't working?" the officer asked, his tone still stern. The elderly man blinked, taken aback. He had no idea. He didn't drive his car much anymore, so he hadn't noticed that the brake lights weren't functioning. He hadn't been able to keep track of every little detail like he used to, and his family hadn't pointed it out to him either. He felt a pang of guilt in his chest. How could he have missed something so important? "I didn't know," the man said, his voice quieter now. "I'll get them checked right away." "I didn't mean to." The officer cut him off, his expression hardening. "You should have known, sir. It's your responsibility to make sure your vehicle is in working order. What if someone didn't see your brake lights and you caused an accident?" The elderly man's face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The officer stood there for a moment, staring at him. For a second, the elderly man thought the officer might just let it go, might offer him some kindness, but then the officer spoke again, and the words hit him like a slap to the face. "You really shouldn't be driving if you can't keep track of things like that," the officer said bluntly. "You're a danger on the road." The elderly man's heart sank. His hands shook and he could feel a lump forming in his throat. It was one thing to be told that he had made a mistake, but it was another to be told that he shouldn't be driving at all, that he was a threat to others. The officer's words stung more than he could express. It felt like the last shred of his dignity had been torn away. "I'm sorry," the man repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I'm just trying to get by." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a citation, which he handed to the elderly man. "Get the brake lights fixed and have them inspected. If I catch you driving again without them fixed, you'll face a much bigger fine. Understand?" The elderly man nodded numbly, unable to find the right words. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. He didn't want the officer to see him cry. He didn't want anyone to see him as weak, as helpless. He just wanted to go home, away from this humiliation. The officer gave him one last cold look before walking back to his car. The elderly man stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had thought he could handle it, but now, standing there in the parking lot, it felt like the world was closing in on him. His mind was racing, his chest tight. But all he could think about was how much he hated this feeling. this feeling of being less than he once was. With shaking hands, he got back in his car and drove home, his eyes stinging as he fought to hold back tears. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this, how much longer he could pretend that everything was okay. He had spent his whole life being strong, being independent, and now it felt like that strength was slipping through his fingers. When he got home, he sat in the car for a while, staring at the house in front of him. He didn't want to go inside, didn't want to face his family, didn't want to face the reality of what was happening. He didn't want to admit that he was no longer the man he used to be. Eventually, he got out of the car and walked inside. His daughter was in the living room, as always, when she came over. She looked up when she saw him, her face softening with concern. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked gently. The elderly man didn't answer at first. He just stood there, his hand on the doorframe, trying to find the words. But they wouldn't come. I don't know, he said finally, his voice trembling. "I just don't know anymore." The next few days felt like a blur. The elderly man tried his best to focus on the little things that usually brought him comfort, but everything felt off. The memories of the officer's words, the coldness of the ticket, and the growing realization that his independence was slipping away weighed on him. Every time he looked at his car, parked in the driveway, it reminded him of how vulnerable he had become. His car had once been a symbol of his freedom, but now it felt like a reminder of everything he was losing. His daughter called again that afternoon. He had been expecting it. She had always been concerned about him, and lately her calls had become more frequent. The elderly man loved his daughter dearly, but he couldn't help but feel frustrated when she called. He knew she was only trying to help, but the constant reminders about how he shouldn't drive, how he should let someone else take care of things, it made him feel small. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't do things for himself anymore. He didn't want to give up on the life he had built. He picked up the phone, bracing himself for the familiar conversation. "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling today?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with concern. "I'm fine," he replied, his tone a bit sharper than he intended. "Just a little tired, that's all." His daughter paused before speaking again. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we talk about getting you some help around the house. You shouldn't be doing everything yourself anymore. You've been through a lot, and it's okay to accept help." The words stung more than he expected. He had heard them before, but they were starting to feel like a reminder of his decline. He didn't want help. He didn't want to be taken care of. He wasn't ready to become one of those people who needed assistance for everything, who couldn't even make it through the day without someone else doing the heavy lifting. "I'm not helpless, he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm doing fine. I don't need help." "But Dad," she said, her voice soft but insistent, "you're not fine. You can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. You don't have to do this alone." "I can handle it," he replied, his voice cracking slightly. He didn't want to admit the truth, didn't want to face it. "I'm fine. I just need some time to figure things out." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. His daughter didn't say anything at first, but he could feel her disappointment through the phone. She wasn't angry, just worried, and that worried him more than anything. "I know you think you're fine," she said finally, "but you've got to listen to your body. You've been through so much, Dad. You can't keep pushing yourself like this." He closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to come. He hated feeling like this, like a burden, like he was falling apart. The truth was, he didn't know what to do anymore. He didn't know how to keep going like this, pretending that everything was okay when deep down he knew it wasn't. "I'll think about it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "But I'm not ready for that yet." "Okay, Dad," she replied, her voice filled with both love and concern. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. As he hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation lingered in the air. He sat there for a long time, staring at the walls around him, feeling both helpless and lost. He had always prided himself on his independence. He had worked hard his whole life to provide for his family, to build a life that he could be proud of. And now it felt like that life was slipping away, piece by piece. He knew he couldn't keep driving like he used to, but the thought of giving up his car, of handing over that last shred of freedom, was more than he could bear. His mind wandered back to the officer's words, the accusation that he was a danger on the road, that he shouldn't be driving anymore. The officer had been right in some ways, but that didn't make it easier to accept. It felt like a loss, like another part of his life was being taken from him without his permission. Over the next few days, the elderly man found himself retreating more and more into his own thoughts. He stopped going out as often, preferring the quiet of his home to the outside world. He spent long hours sitting in his favorite chair by the window, watching the world go by but feeling disconnected from it all. He had always enjoyed the simple things, the sound of birds outside, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. But now it all seemed distant, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. One afternoon, while sitting in his chair, he noticed a young woman walking down the street. She was pushing a stroller, her baby cooing softly in the seat. The man watched her for a moment, a feeling of nostalgia washing over him. He remembered the days when his own children were small, when he and his wife would walk down the street with strollers of their own. Those days had seemed so full of promise, so full of life. But now everything seemed so empty, so quiet. He thought about his children and how much they had grown up. They had their own lives now, their own families to take care of. They had their own responsibilities, their own concerns, and yet they still worried about him, still tried to take care of him. It made him feel small, like he was no longer the person they had once looked up to, the person who had always been there for them. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly to the kitchen, trying to shake off the feelings that had settled over him. He needed to do something, anything to distract himself from these thoughts. As he opened the refrigerator, his eyes fell on the carton of eggs, and for a moment he considered making himself a simple meal. It had always been one of his favorite things to do, cooking breakfast in the morning, making a cup of coffee, and enjoying the quiet. But as he reached for the eggs, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. He felt it deep in his bones, that tiredness that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. It was the weight of everything that had been happening lately. His body wasn't what it used to be, and neither was his life. Everything felt harder now. He set the carton of eggs back in the refrigerator and sat down at the kitchen table. The kitchen was quiet too. He realized that he hadn't heard the phone ring in a while, hadn't heard anyone stop by to check on him. The silence was almost too much to bear. Just then, there was a knock on the door. It startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He slowly got up and walked to the door, wondering who it could be. When he opened the door, he saw a neighbor standing on the porch, a friendly smile on her face. "Hi there," she said cheerfully. "I was just wondering if you needed anything. I'm heading to the store and I thought I'd check if you needed anything while I'm out." For a moment, the elderly man just stared at her. The simple offer of help, the kindness in her voice hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone to reach out, someone to offer help without judgment. "I'm fine," he said, his voice quiet. "But thank you." "That's very kind of you," she smiled again. "Well, if you change your mind, just let me know." As she turned to leave, the elderly man stood there for a moment, watching her walk away. For the first time in days, he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have to do everything on his own. Maybe it was okay to accept help even if it was hard. The days that followed felt a little different. The elderly man wasn't sure if it was the kindness of the neighbor's unexpected visit, or the fact that he had started to consider the possibility of asking for help more seriously. But he felt a shift. It wasn't a huge change, but it was enough to make him feel less isolated, less stuck in his own world. He had been reluctant to admit that he needed help, but for the first time in a while he allowed himself to consider it. Maybe it wasn't a weakness to lean on others. Maybe it was a part of life that everyone had to accept at some point. The neighbor's gesture, though small, had been a reminder that people cared about him, that he wasn't as alone as he sometimes felt. It wasn't just his daughter and family who worried about him. It wasn't just about being a burden or losing his independence. People saw him as a person, not just an elderly man who was fading away. The man had spent so much time focusing on his own pride, trying to hold on to the life he had built, that he had almost forgotten the value of connections, of being part of a community, of relying on others when things got tough. His thoughts had always been consumed with fear of losing his independence, of becoming a burden. But now he started to see that it wasn't about giving up who he was. It was about finding new ways to stay connected, to continue living with dignity and purpose, even if that meant asking for help sometimes. He spent the next few days doing things that brought him a sense of normalcy. He took a walk down the street to get the mail, something simple but comforting. He noticed the little things again. The way the trees had started to lose their leaves. The way the neighborhood dogs ran around barking happily. He even stopped by the small park at the end of his street and sat on one of the benches, watching the children play. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace, a brief escape from the weight of everything that had been troubling him. But his thoughts still drifted back to the officer. The harsh words, the ticket, the feeling of being judged, those moments had stayed with him longer than he had expected. He couldn't shake the sense of shame that had settled deep within him. It was like the officer's cold treatment had planted a seed of doubt, one that grew with every passing day. But he also knew that he couldn't let that moment define him. He couldn't let one encounter with someone who didn't understand his struggles dictate how he saw himself. It wasn't easy, but he knew he had to move past the officer's words. He had spent so many years building his life, his family, his sense of self-worth. A single interaction couldn't erase all that. Slowly, he began to reclaim his own narrative, to remind himself of the man he had been before the stroke. The man who had always stood tall, who had faced challenges head-on. His family continued to check in, and his daughter made sure to call regularly. Every conversation was the same, her offering help, him pushing it away. But one day, during one of their calls, something shifted. "How's it going, Dad?" she asked, her voice warm but still carrying a trace of concern. "I'm doing better," he replied, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "I've been thinking about what you said, about getting help around the house." There was a pause on the other end, a surprised silence before she spoke again. "Really? Dad, that's great to hear. I know it's hard, but it could make things so much easier for you. I don't need much help. Just someone to come by every now and then. Maybe help me with some of the heavy lifting," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not ready to give up everything, but I think it's time I admit that I can't do it all on my own." The relief in his daughter's voice was palpable. "I'm so proud of you, Dad. You don't have to do everything by yourself. We're here for you." The elderly man smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was making progress, like he was taking a step forward instead of retreating. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. That afternoon, he called the neighbor who had offered to help, and the two of them talked about setting up a schedule for small tasks around the house. She didn't make him feel like he was a burden. She simply offered her help in a way that felt natural without any judgment. The idea of having someone stop by every now and then didn't feel like giving up. It felt like an opportunity to still be a part of life, to continue living with dignity. As the weeks went by, the elderly man started to feel more at peace with the changes in his life. He accepted that his independence might look different now, but it didn't mean he had to lose everything. He still went out for short walks, still took care of his garden, and still cooked for himself when he could. But he no longer felt like he had to do it all on his own. He allowed himself to be helped, and in doing so, he found a new kind of freedom, one that wasn't tied to the idea of doing everything by himself. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table drinking his tea and watching the sun set outside, he felt a sense of calm that had eluded him for so long. His family, his neighbors, the people who cared about him, he wasn't alone. He didn't have to hide his struggles or pretend everything was okay. He could lean on the people around him, and that didn't make him weak. It made him human. The man looked out the window, his eyes softening as he watched the stars begin to appear in the evening sky. There was a time when he had believed that asking for help was a sign of failure, that it meant giving up. But now he realized it was the opposite. It was a sign of strength. It was a sign of knowing when to accept support and when to let others in. As he finished his tea and stood up to head to bed, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had made it through a difficult time, and though the road ahead wasn't always clear, he knew that he was stronger than he had given himself credit for. He wasn't defined by his age, his stroke, or the mistakes he had made. He was defined by the life he had lived, the love he had shared, and the resilience that still burned within him. The man smiled to himself as he turned off the lights and made his way to bed. He had learned a valuable lesson in the past few weeks, that strength wasn't about doing everything on your own. Strength was about allowing yourself to be supported, to accept help, and to keep going even when things got tough. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next.